Thanks, everyone, for coming. We're going to talk a little bit today about the SEC and crypto. That's going to be our focus. I think we'll start talking a little bit generally, and then as we get closer to the end, start talking about the Ripple's case and its market success in the SEC's lawsuit. And then hopefully we'll have time to ask a few questions. So, Stu, thanks very much.
Great to be here.
For joining us today. I'll start with a kind of a broad general question, which is just that, you know, over the past few years, let's say, and I'll let you define few, because when folks look at the SEC, different time frames mean different things, you know, to all of us. How would you assess I guess even more broadly, the U.S. federal government's and then the SEC specifically response and attitude toward digital ledger technology innovation?
Sure. Well, thrilled to be here. And whenever I do leave the U.S., and even though it was only a 2-hour flight to come here to Toronto, I'm outside of the U.S. It's unfortunate that we have to have this conversation because the U.S. is an outlier in a negative way in terms of their attitudes toward crypto and the crypto economy and the technology that underlies it, the entrepreneurs that back it, the jobs that it creates, the tax dollars that it generates. So what we have in the U.S. Is a very hostile and negative view when it comes to crypto. That starts at the executive branch with the president, and the president appoints the heads of the different regulatory agencies, in this case including the Securities and Exchange Commission. And we have a gap, we have a policy gap in the U.S. about how to regulate crypto. And I think everybody agrees that that policy gap should have the aims of protecting consumers, protecting the integrity of the market, keeping bad actors out, but doing all of that in a way that enables the innovation. And in the US, the SEC, rather than working collaboratively with the industry and with the legislative branch to build a clear regulatory framework, has instead filled that regulatory gap through enforcement actions. And what that has done, it has chilled the industry. It has driven a lot of players outside of the US. It's driven a lot of players into bankruptcy. Very few players, Ripple being one of them, can withstand that onslaught and defend themselves. So I think that's a very long way of saying, to summarize, that US, very negative, not working constructively with policymakers to come up with a clear regulatory framework, and instead looking to suffocate the industry through regulation, through enforcement.
So you mentioned there's a term that we academics use called regulation by enforcement, which is applied to the SEC a lot. And that what we mean by that is that rather than engaging in notice and comment rulemaking or working under guidelines established by Congress or the legislature, what the SEC does is it sees someone it doesn't like and files an enforcement action, a lawsuit in effect. You know, and it does that in the context that I'm going to read the SEC's mission here for the room. Excuse me. Its mission is quote, to protect investors, protect markets, and facilitate capital formation, end quote. So talk a little bit about the effect of that, of the SEC's stance on the SEC's mission as you see it from the perspective of, you know, a leading DLT company, kind of speaking broadly. So,
you know, George read the mission of the SEC, and unfortunately, while that looks pretty on their website, all of their actions when it comes to crypto are having the exact opposite effect. Consumers are not being protected. All of the crypto bankruptcies that we've seen in the US, the consumers are left holding the bag in bankruptcy court, last in line as unsecured creditors. Bad actors are not being kept out of the system. See Sam Bankman-Fried on trial as we speak. Capital market formation, VCs are not leaning in to this industry in the US for fear that all roads will lead to the SEC. So they're doing just the opposite. As I said earlier, regulation by enforcement is a really important term. I like it. for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is the SEC hates it. And they say that we're not engaging regulation by enforcement, we're just enforcing the laws, and the laws are clear. And that's the problem. Not only are the laws not clear when it comes to how to apply the securities laws to crypto, we have a regulatory gap that the SEC itself recognizes, and we know that because we got their emails. But we also know that because the SEC has been working intentionally, at least since 2015, to foster greater uncertainty in the marketplace. And again, we have that from their internal emails. We know that the General Counsel of the SEC advised senior officials at the SEC that they are fostering greater uncertainty rather than bringing clarity. And George, I think you'll appreciate this point given the work you do. A regulator likes uncertainty because they can play with uncertainty by not defining the rules and therefore punish the market through this regulation by enforcement. And most, if you get an SEC enforcement letter, investigative subpoena, it's a very expensive and grueling process. The process becomes the punishment. Our CEO has been very public that our defense against the SEC has cost us well over $100 million, approaching $150 million. Very few startup companies or privately held companies have those sorts of resources, and that's what the SEC counts on, that they'll surrender through a settlement, and then they can point to the settlement and you say, see, the laws are clear, but that's not clear laws. That's basically leveraging the uncertainty to bully smaller players and either, as I say, force them offshore, force them into a settlement, or force them into bankruptcy court.
Yeah. And so that's very interesting. You know, academics who look at the SEC and kind of its history will say, and academics might be just the royal academic, right? So maybe the royal we. I won't attribute this to anyone else. But you can look at the SEC as having progressed from its foundation after the Great Depression. There was a sense that chaos in the markets and lots of fraud and empty promises led to the Great Depression, right? And I think everyone agrees that we should regulate fraud. Nobody wants fraud. A market cannot function properly if there's fraud in it, right? Starting in the 60s with the then commissioner, we had a commissioner who had a certain view of quote-unquote fairness in the markets and how markets should function, and he thought that the SEC should reflect his view and impose that view onto the nation. And then starting in about the 80s is really when the SEC started on this sort of campaign of uncertainty. And it does this in other areas too, and not just in crypto. And it's actually the SEC is taking this model that you just described for us and bringing it into the crypto or the DLT realm, or the crypto realm in particular. In the 80s, there were areas where Congress wanted to regulate, wanted to define what the law was by statute, and the SEC actually went before Congress and testified and said, don't do this, lobbied Congress, said don't do this, because if you do, it'll take away our flexibility in prosecuting who we want, who we think is not acting in our view of fairness, right? Fast forward then to today, and we've got an environment where crypto companies will ask for no action letters, for example, right? And this is entirely new. This has never happened before, right? We'll ask for a no action letter. The SEC will ignore the no action letter, will ignore the request rather, and refer it directly to enforcement, right? And then there's a lawsuit and everything you described. And so in this environment, what's the effect on innovation? Or what's the effect on the incentive to innovate?
Yeah. Well, that's the slow pitch that I'll answer in a minute, but just to go back to hit some of the points that you've just talked about. A regulator's job, an unelected bureaucrat who's running that agency, who is a political appointee who will come and go in 3.5 years, their job is to apply law, not to make law. And I think the agency's lost its way because it's trying to make law through regulation by enforcement, and that's unconstitutional. Secondly, to George's point, fraud is bad, but you don't need special regulatory or legislative power to police fraud. A state attorney general can police fraud, the Department of Justice can police fraud. There are a number of ways to police fraud. Third, it's a nuanced point, but it's a really important point. What we're talking about here is the jurisdictional reach of a regulator. We're not saying that the crypto economy should not be regulated in the US. We're not saying that fraud should be allowed to run rampant. We're not saying that consumers shouldn't be protected. What we're saying is a regulatory agency like the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's in their name. They only have jurisdiction over securities. And if it's not a security, you don't have jurisdiction over the asset. And let's figure out who has jurisdiction over the asset. That's the piece that's the gray area they're playing in, pretending through regulation by enforcement that they have this jurisdiction when they really don't have it. What happens, and we've talked about this already, is the innovation is being pushed offshore. Crypto is not going to be uninvented. Crypto is not going to be regulated out of existence. Other jurisdictions, Singapore, where we just obtained our major payments institution license, the UK, the EU, Dubai, Brazil, they're telling companies like Ripple, come in, operate in our country, not to be free from regulatory supervision, but come in and operate in our company under a very robust and rigorous regulatory framework. So what's happening? The money's going there, the jobs are going there, the entrepreneurship is going there, the tax dollars is going there, and it's fleeing the US. I mean, the US last year passed the, it's the CHIPS Act, bring, the chips economy, the semiconductor economy back onshore, and we're investing hundreds of billions of dollars because we lost our way. I think in 10 or 15 years, we're gonna have to bring the crypto back to the US Act, right? Because we've lost our way. So the US has fallen behind, it has fallen behind significantly, and I think they're suffering. And a company like Ripple, who's now a global company of 900 employees, more than half exist outside of the US. Don't forget, it was founded by a couple of entrepreneurs in San Francisco. And the US should be embracing that entrepreneurship rather than punishing that entrepreneurship.
Yeah, yeah. So let me ask the next logical question then, right? What should we do? How can we fix this? And I think obviously one answer is regulation by enforcement is just not a viable model for successful business, right? And if the ultimate goal is human flourishing, let's say, to sort of speak very ivory tower and high-mindedly, regulation by enforcement doesn't accomplish that. And one contrast that comes to mind where the US seemed to do everything right was in the internet boom, right? We had a situation where the internet was becoming a thing, it was becoming a public good, let's say, for lack of a better term. There were lots of internet companies out there. Some of them were remarkably successful, Amazon, eBay. But by the way, under the SEC's sort of rules wanting to regulate marketplaces, it's got a proposed rule where it's asking for authority over anything that's a marketplace. I can see eBay and Amazon falling under that description. But anyway, I digress. And then you had spectacular failures, CMGI, for example, right? But out of this enormous sort of creation and destruction and market values moving around, we have a situation where in our pockets or on little tablets, we've got the world's information, right, at our fingertips. And that's got an enormous benefit for human flourishing, right? It's absolutely revolutionary. And can you imagine if the SEC came in and said, look what happened to CMGI, so-and-so sympathetic, plaintiff or complainer lost all his retirement money. The example that comes to mind is the man who invested all his retirement into Palm stock on the day of the IPO when it went up and lost everything. If the SEC said, you know what, this is bad, we're going to go and regulate. We're going to, if you're an internet stock, you have all these extra hoops to jump through, and here are all these enforcement actions to hit you. Right? Contrast that with what's happening in crypto today, right? And it's a completely different question, and there's this risk that if this advancement happens, it won't be here, as you described. So what can we do? Where do we start, and who should start doing that thing?
Well, let me first pick up on a couple of the excellent points you just made. I think the internet in 1996 is a fantastic analogy for crypto as to where it is today. Because the US had a decision to make in 1996. Do we regulate this new and unknown technology called the internet like we do rotary telephones and telegraph machines? Or do we create a wide berth around it and let's see where the innovation takes us? They decided on the latter rather than the former. And we, and as you say, we're walking around with supercomputers in our pockets right now. So when people say, what is the promise of crypto? What's it good for other than rank speculation? My answer is, well, Ripple has a real-world application to facilitate cross-border payments, but beyond that, no one knows the answer to that question. Don't do it now, but Google Bill Gates' interview with David Letterman from 1996, where David Letterman is asking Bill Gates, why do we need desktop computers? Bill Gates doesn't have a good answer for that question in 1996. So nobody knows what the promise of this technology is going to be. Most technology takes 25 or 30 years to reach its full potential. Why is that? Anybody who is alive today who's existed in a world where digital tokens, starting with Bitcoin, only existed during their lifetime today is about in 6th or 7th grade. We need those individuals to get through college, to university, to become engineers, to become great minds, to say, what can we do with this technology? And if we're going to suffocate it through regulation, we're never going to realize that promise. So what can we do? First of all, work with regulators, and Ripple has always worked with regulators throughout the world. We have great relationships with regulators in those foreign jurisdictions. As I said, we just received our major payments license from the Monetary Authority of Singapore after 3 years of due diligence. We're applying for a license in the UK, in Ireland that will passport through the EU, and Dubai. So there are a lot of jurisdictions where they're welcoming the technology. Go to those jurisdictions, work with those regulators. In the US, work with policymakers, continue the discussion. We'll continue to do that. I see Robert Grant in the audience, the head of our policy. Robert's job is to travel the world, both US and beyond, talking with policymakers, educating them. It needs to start with education and hopefully lead them to a right policy solution. And the third thing, when you're faced with regulation by enforcement and regulatory overreach, fight. Defend yourself. Don't surrender. Which is what Ripple chose to do, which is what our CEO chose to do, which what our chairman chose to do, who are named personally in a non-fraud case. There's never been a crypto case in the United States where individuals have been named along with the company with no allegation of fraud. They did it in our suit. Why did they do it? To try to bring us to our knees and surrender, and we didn't. So we fought them, and we won in a very important way. And I think that has given courage to other participants to say, look, I was taught as a young lawyer, even as a middle-aged lawyer, you don't pick fights with regulators. If a regulator comes knocking, you apologize, you bow down deeply, and you try to sort of, make peace with the regulator. Unfortunately, with this regulatory state that we're in, this administrative state we're in, those rules don't apply. And you have to defend yourself. If you think you're right, stand up for what's right, because you're probably going to be right.
And that's probably a good segue into the Ripple case. Though I do have one quick question for you before then. And we agree on the fraud point. On the issues of privacy and security in DLT technology, what role do you think the government and the SEC should play there?
Yeah. I think it's a very, very important point. And if the industry doesn't get this point right, I think every regulator in every jurisdiction is going to be concerned. because we can't have this technology being used by bad actors for nefarious purposes. How you balance that against the anonymous or pseudo-anonymous nature of the technology that is sort of embedded in distributed ledger technology, how you strike that right balance, that I think has to be solved through a public and private partnership. I don't think the SEC has a role in that at all. I think government has the role in that. But again, I think we'll get to the right solution through a private-public partnership. We can't overreach, right? What happens if you try to legislate in an area where you don't understand the technology, you don't understand the impact of your legislation, the legislation can actually kill or suffocate the technology. That we don't want to happen. But on the other hand, we also don't want bad actors leveraging the technology for evil purposes.
So let's shift gears for a few minutes here to the case before we'll leave maybe 2-3 minutes for a couple of questions. But I'll start generally with the case. So what about Ripple's win do you find especially interesting or worthy of further thought or clarification or just a sort of general interest, both at a practical and kind of theoretical level?
Sure. So just to level set, because I'm not sure people may have different degrees of understanding in terms of the case. The SEC sued Ripple, our CEO and our chairman, on December 22nd, 2020, 2 days before Christmas Eve. Thank you very much for the Christmas present. And they alleged that Ripple's sales and distributions of the digital asset XRP, which we used in our tech stack and our customers used to facilitate the cross-border payments, from 2013 to 2020, all of those distributions should have been registered as a security, and XRP itself was a security. We defended that case, and we argued, number one, that a digital asset itself can never be a security. And when I say a security, I'm going to get into the legal weeds here a little bit. Under the Securities Act of 1933, it defines the different things that constitute a security and therefore under the Securities and Exchange Commission's jurisdiction. One of them is a traditional share of stock. So if I buy a traditional share of stock in, let's say, Apple, and I give it or gift it or sell it to George, that stock will always represent a right, title, or interest in Apple, no matter how I bought it, no matter how I distributed it. So it will always be a security. You continue to go through that list, and they list 25, 20-ish things, and they get to something called an investment contract. And we argued that for there to be an investment contract, you need a contract for an investment. And this goes back to a 1946 Supreme Court case in the United States called SEC versus Howey. And what the Howey case was, you had a Orange Grove collective in Florida that sold a lot of slivers of land to tourists coming to Florida. Those tourists bought the slivers of land, have no intention of ever planting orange groves or fertilizing or watering or picking oranges or selling oranges. So when they went back home, the Howey collective said, look, we'll sell you not only the sliver of land, but we'll sell you a management contract. And we will promise that we'll do all of the work to cultivate the oranges, sell the oranges, and to the extent we generate a profit, we'll send those profits back to you. That's a contract for an investment. Because what you're doing is you're investing money in a common enterprise, the business venture of the Howey Orange Grove Collective, and you're relying on profits from the efforts of third parties. So you can take any asset. I can take a bar of gold, I could take a digital asset, I could take an orange grove, I could take a chinchilla, I can take a barrel of whiskey, and I can bundle that with promises and say the asset plus the promises will result in me distributing profits back to you. That's the contract for an investment. But if I break away the promises, all I'm left with is the orange grove, the barrel of whiskey, the chinchilla, the digital asset, etc. Standing alone, that's not a security. The SEC wanted the court to rule that the digital asset itself was something called a crypto asset security. That's the phrase they use. And what the court ruled on July 13th. And by the way, when I got notice of the decision, I was here in Toronto. Good news there. What the judge ruled on July 13th was that the digital asset XRP is not in and of itself an investment contract, because it doesn't embody those bundle of promises that you need to get to an investment contract. That's huge. That was the gut punch to the SEC. That took the wind out of their sails for their entire campaign of regulation by enforcement. They hate that ruling because it destroys their narrative. And what the judge said, let me look at the different categories of distributions from 2013 to 2020. She found some of those distributions, early distributions that were made directly to institutional buyers combined with a contract, those were investment contracts. But other things like trading XRP on Coinbase, not an investment contract, because when you go and you buy a digital asset on a Coinbase, you don't know who the buyer is, and the buyer doesn't know who the seller is, and the seller's not making you any promises, and you're not relying on anything other than, you may buy it for speculation, relying on market forces, you may believe in the technology, who knows, but it says that's not a contract for an investment. Also, if you give away XRP to developers by way of grants, to executives by way of compensation, to charities by way of charitable giving, not an investment contract, because they're not even an investment of money. So what the judge said, look, the asset itself, never an investment contract. You have to look at the transactions, and does the transactions constitute this entire bundle of promises that may have the asset as the subject, but if you break away that asset, you can't have that investment contract. So it's the bundle that is the security, not the subject of the bundle.
Yeah. So what you've been describing makes two things come to mind. One is the ironic result that of the three categories, and by the way, so everyone's interested, the court recently refused to allow an interlocutory appeal on some of the rulings. That just happened a couple of days ago, so congratulations on that. So one ironic result of the court's ruling, I don't know if ironic is the right word here, but of the three categories of recipients of XRP that it looked at, the one where it said that it satisfied the conditions of being a security because it fell under this investment contract definition, which came about in this case from the 40s, about slivers of orange grove trees with like one tree wide, and then they would harvest them for you, as you said, is that the hook for the SEC's, or for the securities laws here, for the SEC's hand, are the sophisticated institutional investors who actually don't need the protections of the protections, in quotes, of the securities laws at all, right? And to me, that suggests that the securities laws themselves are just a terrible vehicle for regulating cryptocurrency. Another thing that it made me think of is the situation of Coinbase, where you mentioned that it was about 10, 12 years after XRP got out there that the SEC came. So in the case of Coinbase, Coinbase filed to be a public company, filed its S1, disclosed everything it was going to be. It was going to be an exchange for trading crypto tokens, right? It disclosed everything it was going to do, staking, the whole nine. The SEC accepted it, accepted the S1, allowed Coinbase to go public, and allowed Coinbase to operate for nearly that long, maybe not quite that long, I don't remember the date now. And just recently went after Coinbase, saying that it was an illegal exchange. I'm going to ask what is going on, but I guess I don't have to. It would be a rhetorical question. But it's quite remarkable, right? Necessarily embodied in the SEC's allowing Coinbase to go public is that it's for the public and investor benefit for this to be a public company. It cannot say it didn't know what Coinbase was doing and now it's going after it for being a public exchange.
That's right. I mean, what the SEC is doing real institutional damage to the commission. In our case, they've been called out by the judge in a ruling for acting hypocritically, for not engaging in the faithful allegiance to the law, and the recent decision last week on the appeal for twisting and misrepresenting the court's holdings to the court. And I know we're out of time, but on the SEC case, they're now saying just because we approved the public filing and allowed Coinbase to go public doesn't mean we can't sue them for operating in unregistered securities in exchange. And again, just logically, intuitively, put aside legally, it just doesn't make sense. And I think they're going to continue to lose these battles in court and expose the agency as not being infallible, but being very fallible.
So we had more points we wanted to cover. I see the timer's at 1, now at 0 seconds. If we have time for a question or two, we're happy to do it, but I'll leave that up to our organizers, perhaps.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Why don't you wait for the mic?
Oh, apologies.
Yeah, just for the recording.
Yeah, absolutely.
First of all, I just want to say that, in my opinion, the behavior of the SEC set back the innovation in the crypto space decades in the United States, which is a horrible thing. And my question is, do you think in the future cryptos will be regulated by the CFTC rather than the SEC? Or will there be a new department? Or there will be no regulators at all for cryptos?
Yeah, well, God forbid, we don't want a new regulator. That's the last thing the United States needs is another regulator. Whether it's this, to me, I think ultimately there could be shared jurisdiction between the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. But we need a clear regulatory framework for that shared jurisdiction to allow the technology to work while serving those policy goals. So I think ultimately, hopefully through legislation, we could get to some shared regulatory framework.
I think that's right. I tend to agree with that. I think wherever the regulation sits, I think it needs to be clearly defined, and probably Congress is the place to define it. And I come from Wyoming, which is sort of many of you know, the crypto home in the US. And in Wyoming, we've done a reasonably good job at regulating it, creating special purpose depository institutions, for example, that can accept crypto as deposits, right? It's all clearly defined in statute, and everyone knows what the rules are going in. So I think that's the most important point, wherever it sits. Because ultimately, you can grab a group of experts who are good at this topic and put them in one building or the other. Now, there are institutional concerns, right? I'd like to see the SEC shrink rather than get bigger for the reasons we've talked about, because there's an unhealthy culture there. But ultimately, you can put the experts anywhere as long as their reach is cabined by the legislature, right? To where it promotes healthy markets rather than stifling innovation. Sir.
How much does it matter that the US is crypto antagonistic if the rest of the world is getting on board?
I think that's a good question. And it's interesting. Let me start here that after the SEC sued us, that's all we talked about is the SEC case. And I remember our chief executive was visiting Dubai, meeting with the regulator, and he started the conversation to talk about the SEC case. And afterwards, he got some feedback from our local managing director on the ground and said, you don't have to talk about the SEC case. They don't care about the SEC case. And then as I went to London and started Singapore, they're really not interested. So I think, so that would suggest that it doesn't matter, but the United States is still the largest economy in the world. It still has massive influence. It still is very fertile ground for entrepreneurs, engineers, people with bigger brains than me. So you would like to see the US come along. And that's why I think at the end of the day, it does matter. And the US has to get it right.
Yeah, I think, an advantage the US has is high political stability and size, right? And size and ability to attract capital. And those two things are a good combination for innovation, I think. Other places that are very politically stable aren't as big. Now, that may be a problem, it may not be, right? But it's good to operate. It's good to be able to operate, or it's good for a technology if it can benefit from that sort of nexus of good attributes.